Remember, well, hopefully all of you remember, a couple months ago I did a lesson from John chapter 8 and the woman caught in adultery, and about a month later I was thinking about what I wanted to talk about, and I somehow ended up back talking about the blind man in John 9 as a reference to how the discussion went in John chapter 8. And I remember telling somebody at the time, I might as well just go ahead and preach through the rest of the book of John and just stay on it. And sure enough, here we are a month later, and I find myself now in John chapter 10 because we're talking about the idea, based on our discussions of the eldership, talking about Jesus the Good Shepherd, who is, well, I was going to say in a lot of ways, but in every way, is the model for what a shepherd should be over the Lord's church. And so this seemed a very appropriate place to start as we begin these discussions. And so now we're in chapter 10, and I guess you can expect next month I'll do something about chapter 11. So I guess that's what we're going to do. But that's okay with me. The book of John is a fascinating book, and it impresses me, and I'm sure it impressed all of you who have read it, at the depth and the care that he takes to assemble these specific ideas, these specific stories and discourses and miracles, all for the purpose of taking this narrative and having these themes, whether it be of light and darkness, whether it be of witness, whether it be of God's, of Jesus' deity, whatever it might be, and carrying them through the entire book. It's really interesting to see how those themes develop. And they're coming kind of to a head here in chapter 10, where we see Jesus continuing the discussion that he had started in chapter 9. That was related to what we saw in chapter 8. So I want to do a kind of a little review to talk about, to get us back in the mindset of where we are in the story. The story so far, if you remember, this all started back in the beginning of chapter 8 when Jesus stands up and says, I am the light of the world. And he starts talking about this idea of light and darkness. And in verse 12 of chapter 8, he says, I am the light of the world. Whoever follows me will not walk in darkness, but will have the light of life. And of course, the idea is that the Pharisees who are arguing against me are in darkness. They've cast out the light. They refuse the light, as John talks about earlier. He talks about this idea of true and false witness. In verses 14 through 15 of chapter 8, it says, even if I do bear witness about myself, my testimony is true, for I know where I come from and where I'm going. But you do not know where I come from, where I'm going. You judge according to the flesh. I judge no one. So, in other words, I've seen where I've been. I know where I've been. And you're asking me you're trying to invalidate what I'm saying based on the idea that I'm the only one that can testify that I've seen these things. And he says that's not the case. So he then contrasts the idea of the works of God or the works of the devil. He talks down in verse... let's see, where is it? In verse 28, 29, it says, when you have lifted up the Son of Man, then you will know that I am he and that I do nothing of my own authority, but speak just as the Father taught me, and he who sent me is with me. He has not left me alone, for I always do the things that are pleasing to him. Verse 28, 29, he contrasts that with the Pharisees. He says, if you were Abraham's children, you would be doing the works Abraham did, but now you seek to kill me, a man who has told you the truth that I heard from God. This is not what Abraham did. You are doing the works that your father did. Now, and later on in verse 39 through 41, he says, you are of your father the devil. In verse 44, you are of your father the devil, and your will is to do your father's desires. And of course, that leads to the ultimate, really the biggest image that he tries to create, this contrast between sight and blindness. And he goes about creating what I talked about at the time is almost a living parable, where he goes and takes this blind man and gives him his sight and gives a demonstration of exactly the kind of mindset that he has been talking about in chapter 8. The Pharisees who have been blinded to the truth of God, that have been refusing to see all the signs that Jesus had done and refusing to draw the proper conclusions, he gives them a literal example of this. Enshadowed in this man who has now been given his sight, he is testifying to the fact that Jesus has restored his sight. And now we watch the Pharisees, against all reason, completely refute this testimony, refusing to believe. So we see this theme that is kind of developed. And at the very end, of John chapter 9, where we left off, it says, for judgment I came to this world, that those who do not see may see, those who say we see may become blind. Some of the Pharisees near him heard these things and said to him, "Are we blind?" And Jesus said to them, "If you were blind, you would have no guilt, but now you say we see, and your guilt remains." And the idea is, if you admit you're blind, you would be seeking someone to restore your sight. But you're not doing that. You're convinced that you can see, that everything is just fine the way it is, and you're refusing to come to Christ so that you can be healed. And that's what brings us to chapter 10. And again, the chapters sometimes don't do us any favors. And I think what happens in chapter 10, we're going to see an extension of what he has been talking about. And if you want to, let's read the first 18 verses. I'm going to break these up a little bit. But I want to go ahead and read the entire passage just so we can have a context, and we'll go back and do some discussion. It says in verse 1, "Truly I say to you, he who does not enter the sheepfold by the door, but climbs in another way, that man is a thief and a robber. But he who enters by the door is the shepherd of the sheep. To him the gatekeeper opens. The sheep hear his voice, and he calls his own sheep by name and leads them out. When he has brought out all his own, he goes before them, and the sheep follow him, for they know his voice. A stranger they will not follow, but they will flee from him, for they do not know the voice of the strangers." This figure of speech Jesus used with them, but they did not understand what he was saying to them. So Jesus again said to them, "Truly, truly, I say to you, I am the door of the sheep. All who came before me are thieves and robbers, but the sheep did not listen to them. I am the door. If anyone enters by me, he will be saved and will go in and out and find pasture. The thief comes only to steal and kill and destroy. I came that they may have life and have it abundantly. I am the good shepherd. The good shepherd lays down his life for the sheep. He who is hired hand and not the shepherd, who does not own the sheep, sees the wolf coming, leaves the sheep and flees, and the wolf snatches them and scatters them. He flees because he is a hired hand and cares nothing for the sheep. I am the good shepherd. I know my own, and my own know me, just as the Father knows me, and I know the Father. And I lay down my life for the sheep. And I have other sheep that are not of this fold. I must bring them also, and they will listen to my voice. So there will be one flock and one shepherd. For this reason the Father loves me, because I lay down my life that I may take it up again. No one takes it from me, but I lay it down of my own accord. I have authority to lay it down, and I have authority to take it up again. This charge I have from the Father." So there's a lot going on there. And I think that typically when we read this, we think of this as a single, whether you want to call it a parable or an analogy or whatever you want to say. The idea is that Jesus is drawing a parallel, and it's a little odd because if you'll notice, he represents himself in two different ways here, doesn't he? He says, first of all, I am the door, and he discusses how the shepherd interacts with the door. But then he's going to later on go and say, I am the good shepherd. Most people that I've read will argue and make the point that what Jesus is doing here is portraying himself as two different elements in the same story, and that may very well be the case. I'm going to treat it a little bit differently today for selfish reasons, because I want to come back tonight when we talk about, and we're going to spend more time in the first part of this passage where it talks about Jesus as the door. Because I think there's a lot that can be said there, and a lot can be related to the discussion about eldership, which is, of course, why we're here to begin with. The idea that how the shepherd interacts with the door, what the door means to the sheep and the one who is leading them. Now, having said that, it's certainly not out of the realm of possibility that Jesus is considering himself as both things in this analogy. If you think about how some of the sheep folds of that day were set up, if you can kind of see up here, you've got a wall of stone that's built up high enough to where the sheep are protected. They can't get out. The predators can't see them on the outside. And there is one door. And if you'll notice, if you can see what that is, the door is actually the shepherd himself. He's sitting in the doorway. He is acting as the barrier between the predators outside and the sheep on the inside. He's making sure that sheep can't wander off. They are where they're supposed to be. But obviously at the time when he's going to lead them out, he's going to get up, he's going to call the sheep, and he's going to lead them away. So there's a real sense in which Jesus can very well be both the door and the shepherd in this analogy. But I'm going to treat him a little bit separately, other than to make a quick point about this idea of what Jesus is trying to say in this first analogy. These first 5 verses, if you want to look at this, basically what he is doing here is telling the parable. He's telling the analogy. He doesn't make any teaching out of it. This is the scenario of how a shepherd interacts with his sheep, and we all understand how this works. And he describes it, and of course the Pharisees don't understand it. It's reminiscent of when Jesus in Matthew 13 speaks to them only in parables. And nobody understands what he's talking about. But Jesus is going to make very sure that they understand exactly what he's talking about here, because he tells them, I am the door. And then he elaborates on that and says, all who came before me are robbers and thieves. And that's an interesting point. And I think what he's trying to do now, and really this is going to thread itself through the rest of what he's going to say, is he is going to take the example of how things ought to be. This example of the sheep and the shepherd is a great parallel to how God had designed God's people to be led. Now, how is it happening in real life? Now, who's he talking about? Who are the robbers? Well, it seems kind of odd. It sounds like he's saying that everybody before Jesus was a robber and a thief. And we know that can't be true. We know there were apostles. There were prophets that came before him. There were good men that led Israel before him that were not considered to be robbers and thieves. I don't think that's what he's talking about here. And even in his own day, John the Baptist came before him. John was not a robber or a thief. I think what he's talking about, and the context makes it pretty clear, that what he's saying is that those who have been established as the shepherds of Israel at Jesus' time, because he says, all who came before me are, present tense. These are people that are still here. These are the people that are leading Israel right now. And all these people are robbers and thieves. Why? Because they're not going through the door. They are trying to go through their own way. And two, as he's going to make very clear before, their motives have nothing to do with the care of the sheep. Their motives are all self-centered. They are, as he calls in Matthew 23, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites. In verse 15, he talks about, he says that you travel across sea and land to make a single proselyte, but when he becomes a proselyte, you make him twice as much a child of hell as yourself. You're not doing this so that you can increase the health of the saints, or the followers, or your sheep. You're doing it to enrich yourself. They love, as he says, the greetings in the marketplace. They enlarge the phylacteries in their garments. They love to be called rabbi. You're doing this because of what the sheep can do for you. And he's going to, whether you want to talk about them in terms of being robbers and thieves in this first part of the passage, or whether you want to talk about them in terms of being a hireling later on, which he uses as another example of describing them as well. Regardless of why you're doing it, you're not doing this for the benefit of the sheep. You're getting rich off them, you're getting fat off them, you're feeding off them. And this shouldn't have been a confusing metaphor at all. This is not anything that is new. If you remember, we read out of Ezekiel chapter 34 a couple of weeks ago, and talking about the idea, the parallel of the sheep and the shepherd, and how God's shepherds back at that time had been abusing the sheep. They had been, they had not been raising them properly. And another example over in Jeremiah chapter 23. If you want to turn over there, Jeremiah chapter 23. This is a pretty common representation. And it shouldn't have been surprising then, the idea that not all shepherds are good shepherds. Not all shepherds are useful. Not all shepherds have the best interests of the flock at heart. And in chapter 23 of Jeremiah, we read in verse 1, woe to the shepherds who destroy and scatter the sheep of my pasture, declares the Lord. Therefore, thus saith the Lord, the God of Israel, concerning the shepherds who care for my people, you have scattered my flock and have driven them away, and you have not attended to them. Behold, I will attend to you for your evil deeds, declares the Lord. Then I will gather the remnant of my flock out of all the countries where I have driven them. I will bring them back to their fold, and they shall be fruitful and multiply. I will set shepherds over them, who will care for them, and they shall fear no more, nor be dismayed, neither shall any be missing, declares the Lord. Behold, the days are coming, declares the Lord, when I will raise up for David a righteous branch. He shall reign as king and deal wisely, and shall execute justice and righteousness in the land. So there's two ideas. He says, first of all, I'm going to replace these unprofitable shepherds and going to bring in people who are seeking the good of the flock, who are seeking the health of the flock. And second of all, there's going to be one in particular that I'm going to raise up. And if you remember, Ezekiel talks specifically about this. I will shepherd my flock. I will set before them. I will go out. I will gather them. And so we see two aspects of this. And I think, and this is why I'm going to come back and talk a little bit about this first part, involving the door and how the shepherd interacts with it. We'll talk about that more tonight. But there's an idea here that this is how a good shepherd acts. And this is how you're acting. And we saw that, of course, the example that played out in chapter 9. What was this blind man other than one of the sheep? How did they treat him? What was he useful for them? He was useful as a prop for the sole purpose of discrediting Jesus. And as long as he was willing to do that, he was of use. When he refused to do that, we cast him out of the synagogue. That's not the behavior of a good shepherd, is it? So, with that in mind, let's talk about the bulk of this, and I think what the main purpose is, and the primary the primary example here, and the primary analogy he makes is, I am the good shepherd. And the emphasis is on good. I think I've read some articles that talked about the context of this, and the verbiage of this indicates that Jesus is putting an emphasis on good. I am the good shepherd, as opposed to all these other shepherds. There is a quality about me that stands beyond what you're getting from everybody else right now.